Please welcome my very first guest on the Psych Tech at Work podcast, Tara Behrend. Tara is a professor of HR and labor relations at Michigan State University. She's the head of the WAVE Lab, or Workplace and Virtual Environments Lab, that's jointly between Purdue University and Michigan State University. And Tara is the current president of the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology, or SIOP. And she's the first guest on this podcast for a couple of reasons. First of all, because this episode is dropping on the very first day of PsyOp 2024 in Chicago. So I'll be there, as you're probably listening to this. And, Tara has also done a lot of really fascinating work that I feel embodies the work of a psychologist, someone thinking about the psychology of humans in the workplace and technology. And so we'll talk about that today on the show. We'll talk a lot about surveillance and, what it means to be an employee in an organization where, you're being surveilled, I guess is the way to say it, right? What does that do to your psychology? We'll find out a little bit about that. We'll talk about the psychology of remote work, psychology of learning, skills attainment, and AI. Tara will share some great perspectives on these things. And one of the things I really like about her and about having her on the show as a guest is, she is a true embodiment of a scientist, practitioner, and psychologist, right? So we are going to talk a lot about research, actual, methodologically sound, empirical research. All of us who've been practitioners, we have so many great stories. We've learned so much, and there's a lot of truth behind those things. But we rarely get a chance to do, really high quality research to look at these things. And the reality is that research and blend with our experience and practice is what really finds the truth, I believe. And I think Tara has a lot of good truth to share. So without further ado, welcome to Psych Tech at Work, Tara.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'd love for you to introduce yourself to our guests. I'm looking forward to a scintillating, fun conversation, but let us know a little bit about yourself, your current role, and kind of how you've gotten to where you are now. What's your journey been?
Sure. I'm an industrial and organizational psychologist. I'm currently the president of SIOP, which is our primary presidential professional association. Yes, very exciting. I'm wrapping up my term in a few weeks, actually, so I'm also looking forward to retirement. In my work life, I'm a professor of human resources and labor relations at Michigan State University. Before that, I worked at Purdue and George Washington University. I also spent a few years at the National Science Foundation as a program officer, where I oversaw the Future of Work program. My research has two main buckets. The first bucket is about the psychological implications of new technologies in the workplace, how we learn, how we connect to each other, how we think about our work. And the other has to do with how people learn about their jobs in a broader sense. And so lately I've been working on a number of different projects related to career and technical education and how we get more people thinking about more kinds of jobs as we think about the evolving workforce and evolving demands of that workforce. How do we respond to those changes?
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, and so couple of notes here. Well, president of PsyOp, that's awesome. You're the second, I believe, PsyOp president I've had on, with our dear friend Fred Oswald being the other one. So you're in really good company. And, I think tell me, like, what's your favorite thing been about that?
About leading SIOP?
Yeah, what is it?
Sure. Well, SIOP is a really special organization because there are so many critical functions of the organization that are run by volunteers. We have something like 700 volunteers supporting everything from building the conference, which 5,000 people attend, to organizing all of our professional development offerings, to organizing our federal government relations efforts. And so these are really exciting projects, and they're all led by people who just have a passion for IO psychology. So for me, it's incredibly exciting to sit in a position where I can learn about all of those different activities, support them, help make sure we're all sort of rowing in the same direction towards our strategic plan and our strategic initiatives. But the breadth of what PsyOp does is really just kind of dazzling. And so it's been so fun to see it from this seat.
Yeah, so let's see, I have missed one PsyOp since 1992. So I'm like in a 30-year veteran here. And I love it. And what I've seen about it, and I'm sure you've noticed and probably even been a part of it, is just the expansion of the focus or kind of areas that people are coming from. So a lot more commercial, looking at technology and startups, a lot more international. I just feel like it's grown, right? I mean, so much. And there's so much more unique and interesting stuff going on. It's a conference where I go to a lot of conferences where the content is really just kind of secondary or not that great. But from a content perspective, it's been amazing. And I've enjoyed contributing to the program a good deal. And I think that's another piece of it. People are very active in wanting to contribute, like you said, even on the content side. So
Yeah, but to your point, there are not very many organizations or conferences that I can think of where science and practice are both represented and they're both integrated. Ordinarily it would have something that is sort of exclusively corporate, like a trade show feeling, or
mhm.
exclusively academic, where people are just sort of presenting their research to each other in a very sort of close community. But SciOp has to serve both of those audiences, and I think it does it really well, where people are learning from each other. And if you look at the program, there are so many sessions where there's a mix of scientists and practitioners presenting even in the same session, right? Different angles on the same problem, which is so unique. I mean, I go to a lot of conferences and I've never seen it done quite that well, which partly reflects our field, right? Our field is a science practice field, but I think it also reflects this really intentional choice on the part of the conference organizers and the program committee to make sure that we are speaking to all those audiences. But I will say too that as the conference grows, like almost thousands and thousands of people, it's really easy to feel lost and it's harder to find your people. So that's something that I've been thinking about a lot lately. Like, how do we build smaller communities within PsyOps so that you aren't just overwhelmed with 4,000 strangers when you show up and you don't know, where to look for the people who you might learn something from. Because, for us, we've been going for 20 years. We sort of understand how everything works and where people might be, but it's almost impossible to figure that out if you're coming from the outside. So that's something that we're building in a lot of different ways and a lot of different examples. But the whole goal is to say, like, PsyOp is also a small community where you can find your people in addition to being that big overall umbrella organization.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, I know there's communities of practice that are, popping up where you have kind of the, like you said, micro things. I also think the WOVA app that's used is a good way. I couldn't believe all the cross communication, about goofy stuff and about stuff that people share in common. It's really entertaining even to just to take a look at that. That's kind of a new thing. Well, that's great. I look forward to it this year. This episode may actually air after the conference, but they have it every year and it just keeps getting better and better. And thank you for, your leadership and your effort to contributing. It's fantastic. So, I really want to talk about your research and your practice stuff too. Some of the stuff I'm familiar with and I thought was really fantastic. It's actually one of the main reasons that I wanted to make sure you could be a guest on the show. But tell us a little bit, just personal, what's on your nightstand? Like, what are you reading? What do you like to stream? What things interest you outside of this world?
Sure. Well, I'm a big science fiction fan, and so I try to keep up with whatever's new in that world. I mean, the options are very numerous, and so I don't pretend to hit all those boxes. But other thing I've been reading a lot lately is biography. So I've started working my way through the Pulitzer Prize winning biography category, like going back in time.
Oh, wow.
And it's
Mm-hmm.
such a fun way of looking at history in a different way, right? Like you look at history through a particular person's experience, and it gives it such a richness, and it really, I think, puts it in a different perspective that I've really enjoyed a lot. And so sometimes I'm reading biographies of people I admire, other times it's people I'm not as familiar with, or people I'm actually not so crazy about, but it still is always just like very entertaining and surprising to hear about folks' lives. So those are the main things I'm reading lately. I'm also a big fan of the Fall of Civilizations podcast. It's pretty brilliant. It sort of chooses one civilization from ancient history and describes
Oh,
how
wow.
it fell apart. Uh, and it's really well produced, but also sort of grim because you start noticing all the commonalities and you think like, oh gosh. But
Very cool. I'll get to check that one out. I always love when I get new suggestions. I've started to become overwhelmed with podcasts. I honestly, my dirty little secret, I didn't really listen to a lot of podcasts, even though I've had one for a while. The game changer for me, I just got these Meta Ray-Ban smart glasses. And so you can listen like hands free. You can take pictures, live stream. It's got a basically a chat GTP, large language model generative AI built into it. You can look at stuff and it'll tell you what it is. It's nuts. But I have two dogs. I walk my dogs. Usually my hands are full and I'm fumbling around, but now I can listen when I'm walking and it's awesome. So I've started to listen to a lot more. I'll check that one out. But there's just not enough time to listen to all of them.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the reason I like the audiobook format is because you can do it while you're doing something else. So,
Yeah.
when I'm walking the dog in the morning or traveling, I spend a lot of time in airports. And
Yeah.
it's really, I can't do meaningful work in those environments, but I can definitely listen to some sort of medium quality podcast
Yeah.
and feel like I'm learning something.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can't do meaningful work in those kind of transitions either. Working on the plane, that's the worst. My arms don't fit. It's horrible. I've had to do it for deadlines before. So tell us a little bit about, so you're at Michigan State now, by the way. Both my parents went to Michigan State. My dad graduated from the clinical psych program in like 1960.
No way.
My cousins go there. Yeah, my mom's from Detroit. So I definitely have a love for Michigan State, although I've never been to East Lansing before, believe it or not. And what a storied psych department there in IO and in clinical as well. So that is awesome. So tell us a little bit about. I mean, you're doing research there. I know you're kind of freshly there compared to the rest of your career, but we'll talk about that a little. But you have done a lot of research, and it's all really good stuff. Is there one thing that you have really learned from all that work, or one profound revelation that you might have had, or maybe it's the collective of it all that's had an influence on you? It really sticks out, you know?
Yeah, I'll say two things. One about the research process, and then two about the findings. So, as far as the research process goes, something I've learned over time is that doing a few projects that you're really excited about, that you think will make a difference in people's lives, is way more valuable than doing a bunch of papers or projects that you don't care about. And it just leads to better work and leads to more work in the end, sort of paradoxically, right? If you're
Yeah.
focusing on doing good work that matters, you end up with a body of work that is maybe bigger than it would be otherwise. But I try to only choose projects that I'm really excited about and that I think really will be useful to somebody, and that will lead us to learn something that is true about the world. So my favorite research projects are always where there are two possible explanations for something, and then the project is a way of figuring out like which explanation is better, or under what circumstances is this explanation more true. So that's something that has emerged over time, and it's something that I really try to keep as a value. As far as things I've learned from the research, two things. One is that we talk about technology a lot. Like we talk about the effect of technology on whatever, everything. But ultimately, it's the people that matter. And that theme shows up in my research over and over again, that technology doesn't have these sort of uniform effects. Rather, we have to think about the psychology of the implementation, how the technology is being used, in what context is it being used, if we want to understand anything about it. We have to think about the particular features. Like you talked about your Meta glasses. Can we say anything about those glasses that applies to other kinds of augmented reality interventions or applications? Like maybe not, right? But we really have to use a psychological lens to understand when it might be true or not true. And so that theme has showed up so many times. And I feel like I'm falling down into a cliche, repeating myself so much about that. But it really is like the people first and the technology second is how we generate insights about technology.
Yeah, 100%. Oh my gosh. Well, it shows up in a lot of things, in every time we start talking about AI, it's like it's not just working on its own. It's the people that are behind it, the people that are working with it. Hopefully, it stays that way. It doesn't get. And I don't want to get too dystopian. I don't like to fall into that trap unless I'm really making hyperbole, to try and make a point. But what you just talked about really came out a lot. Like when you said that, I saw you present at a conference we both presented at. I think it was IPAC, but the work on surveillance, right? That I feel like the takeaway from that really was that kind of individual differences and individual circumstances really made a profound difference in how people saw things psychologically, right? And we are people. So psychology applies to all of us. And when you're in the workplace, you have a lot of interesting dynamics and you throw technology in there and it can get really kooky. And I felt like that was really fascinating research as we look at psychological safety and as devices, right? Like meta glasses, or I don't know if you've ever read the book The Future of Work. I'm trying to remember the author. It's actually not a super recent book, but what they did is they had people wearing little tracker things all day in the office environment, and just kind of watched what they did and tried to draw some conclusions from that data. And I think one of the conclusions is people don't really like that very much. But tell us a little bit about the you know this the surveillance research that you've done, kind of what those studies were, and what did you find there that people would be interested in? Because this is something that's happening, unfortunately, a lot of times when we don't even know it. Hopefully not that often, but it's kind of shady these days sometimes. So
Yeah, well, I try to avoid making claims like you should or should not do X, whatever X might be, and rather focus on what are the behavioral effects when you do X, right? What are the consequences? And can you live with those consequences? And
right,
if not, don't do that thing.
right,
So, in the context of tracking and monitoring, sometimes the purpose is life saving technology, right? Like
yeah,
sometimes you're monitoring whether someone's been exposed to too much radiation, and that's really, really important. And you should definitely keep doing that. Or you're monitoring your eyes for signs of fatigue and you're telling a truck driver to pull over, which
yeah,
is, again, a life saving technology. So I'm never going to say don't track people at work. That's not a useful statement.
sure,
But what I will say is don't use the information that you collect from tracking to generate performance goals. Don't use it
right,
to define what performance really means, because it is not a rich measure of all a person's contributions to the organization. And also, when you do that, when you put these metrics in place, you end up creating perverse incentives and negative consequences. Like the best example is that delivery driver services, I think it's really tempting to use the information from tracking to set new goals about how long your route should take and how long every stop should be. And you might say, like, look, the data say you can do every stop in 37 seconds, so do that. But then what people do is they drive unsafely, right? They don't stop at stop
right,
signs.
yeah, yeah,
They don't even, sometimes they don't even bother stopping at the house, right? Because it's faster to just stick a sticker on the note that says, sorry, we missed you. And you don't want any of those consequences, right? So if you take this data that could be used descriptively and you use it prescriptively, you cause problems. If you
yeah,
take data that were meant to be safety measures and now people are suspicious, then they find ways around the safety measures, and then now they're not accomplishing their safety purpose anymore. So if you were to track, for example, where people are throughout the day for
hmm,
nurses, this is a really valuable thing to be able to deploy who's the closest nurse to an emergency, right?
right, right,
And that's really useful. But if you start punishing the nurses for, you were in this room too long, they'll just take those badges off and throw them in a different room and ignore them. And now they're not serving any purpose at all, and potentially distracting people from things that are more important, right? Because they're focusing on whatever's being tracked. So a lot of people feel like if they're remote workers, then their managers don't know how to manage them. And so they rely on this kind of tracking, and they'll say, like, well, I see that your computer was idle for an hour in the middle of the day. What were you
right,
doing? Well, maybe I was thinking, right? Maybe I was thinking
yeah,
about
yeah, of
new ideas
course,
for the company, or maybe I was having a phone call, or maybe I stepped away, to deal with a personal matter. But it doesn't matter, because what matters is what I'm contributing to the organization, not how many minutes I was in my seat. And that's the danger of these technologies, is that people use them as a shortcut for lazy management,
hmm,
and that's never okay.
yeah. Well, from a psychological standpoint too, though, just how people's attitudes or reactions are, right? I remember again in that research, there was definitely something about just how the company positioned the reason for the surveillance made a really big difference, right? So I think and it goes down to the basic things that people want, right? Communication, rationale, like, so maybe talk about that a little bit. Like, what are the individual circumstances where surveillance does go on that where it can, even if it might seem creepy if it's positioned properly. Maybe people understand and buy into it more.
Maybe. So we did look at in the paper that you're referencing, we did look to see whether the stated purpose had a difference. And actually it doesn't have the kind of difference that you might expect, mostly because people have to believe you when you say it has a purpose. And they're going to use their eyes first. And so if you say this is just for your own benefit, but then you see people getting fired all around you, like that's not a believable message. So what people say and what they do, right, are different. We
Yeah.
can say though that if people are in like a fear mindset, then they're not going to perform at the same level. They're not going to learn anything new. They're going to be afraid to take risks, and taking risks is how you learn new things. So they're not learning anything new. So all of these things we can say for sure happen as soon as people perceive that the purpose of the tool is to punish them. And that perception can come from what they see around them, not what the manager says they're doing, right? So the manager can say, oh, we're just using this for workforce planning. We won't use it for individual consequences. But you're going to look around and see what happens, right? So the part of the reason this is an issue for me too is that all of these cool like AI tutors and real-time feedback systems, they all rely on monitoring for the information
Yeah.
that they use to do the feedback, right? So if that's gone because people are afraid to make mistakes in front of the tool, then the opportunity for them to learn is gone too.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I mean, it is very delicate. Is there a use case that you've seen that's really like the most universally like you just should not be doing this? It feels to anybody who looks at it like that's so wrong. I can't believe they're doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think anything that could be called micromanaging, right, is never going to be beneficial. And it's especially bad if the micromanaging target is something that is personal. So if
Right.
you are sort of crossing those boundaries of people's personal information, like their
Mm-hmm.
emails or who they talk to all day,
Right.
and there's no clear work purpose, that's
Mm-hmm.
never useful.
Yeah. And that happens. You're saying that happens, huh?
All the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, all the time. People think that, this is an unfortunate consequence of the big data revolution. These people are so eager for sources of new data for generating insights, right? Like, how do we train all these cool AI models that we want to implement? Well, we need data. And so they're just grabbing any source of data they can think of to train new models. And the problem is that there are people involved who don't necessarily appreciate having their data taken away from them.
Yeah, it's like somewhat of Dust Bowl empiricism, right? Where you just like getting a bunch of data, globbing it together, and seeing what does that show. And that's never really good. We got to have some rationality in there. What about? And again, I haven't worked internally very much in a company, but my own most of my career. But there's things that'll any company email that's a property of the company, basically, right? So they can scan it and review it. Have you had any experience with just professional email surveillance, we'll call it, and how that goes over?
Well, right. Like my computer has a big sticker on it that says property of Michigan State University, for
Right,
example, right? So they're fully within their rights to look at what I'm doing, what I'm sending from my company accounts, what files I have stored. That's part of my agreement with my employer. And most people have an agreement with their employer that looks something like that, whether they know it or not.
right.
The problem is that there's your real contract, your sort of legal contract, and then there's your psychological contract, your beliefs
Mm-hmm.
about whether you can trust your employer. And that's
Yeah,
the thing that's more fragile. So, yes, Michigan State has the legal right to go read my emails. But if I found out that they were doing that for no reason and that they were sort of making judgments about me based on my emails, I would feel that my personal boundaries have been violated,
yeah,
regardless of whether that's in my actual contract, right? That is a psychological perception about whether I can trust my employer, and that's going to change my behavior because then now I don't do as much sort of organizational citizenship behavior, right? Maybe I don't contribute extra ideas, maybe I don't go beyond what the strict requirements of my job are, and you see that kind of contracting, like, all right, you have violated your part of the deal, so now I am just going strictly to the letter of the law of what I have to do and nothing more, because that's now the nature of our relationship. So that's what you tend to see when people feel that that line has been crossed. Now, the question of like when do you cross the line is an individual one. So some people don't care, and some people care a lot. I looked at, potential personality predictors of who might care. There's race and gender and age effects about who cares more and less. But ultimately, it's going to depend on their own past experiences, their own understanding of their job and their role. How much autonomy do they expect in this job? And those are going to be collections of past experiences and perceptions.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times this may be a way oversimplification, but it boils down to the golden rule, treat other people like you would want to be treated. That's pretty important. And you hear about things in the workplace where people aren't treated like people or like others would, and it's always kind of scary. What do you think in this regard with surveillance? I mean, I feel like it's only going to get crazier and crazier. What do you see in the future around this area? And like maybe what research would you want to do next in this area? What fascinates you about the future of this?
Yeah, so in the months and years following the onset of the pandemic, I think we saw this unbelievable explosion in the market for these technologies.
Yeah.
Like the but we're also seeing a market in technologies that are meant to sort of counteract the surveillance tools. Like the best example is a mouse jiggler, right? It's like a thing that will keep your mouse moving to make it look like your computer's active. You can get $10 on Amazon, or you can make it yourself. And so there's a constant sort of give and take of employers attempting to measure performance with a set of metrics, and then people are reacting to those metrics and finding ways
Yeah.
to exist within them. So I think that interplay is important to remember. What I would hope is that eventually employers catch on to the fact that the way around this, like the way to resolve this, is to just measure performance in a way that's meaningful from the start, instead of using these shortcut measures that are easy to trick. That takes more effort, though. I understand that. The other thing I would say is that, people my age tend to have very different relationships with their employers, in that we are more likely to see them as like an entity that is, I might trust them, I might trust my manager, and we're sort of, it's almost like an interpersonal relationship. And what I'm seeing with younger people is that they're much more skeptical about their employers from the beginning. They're not willing to just say, like, you have my loyalty until you break it, but rather they're starting from a sense of, like, you need to earn my loyalty, which is probably the better perspective, frankly.
Yeah.
And so they're much less likely to take the kind of, bad treatment that maybe people my age would have accepted 20 years ago. They are much more likely to see invasions of their privacy, but also this sort of attack on their dignity, because that's really what it is, right? When you
Yeah.
track people this way, you're taking away their humanity and their dignity, and you're reducing them to this set of metrics that is just very inhumane. So nobody likes that, right? People are differentially willing to put up with it, but nobody enjoys it. And what I'm seeing is really inspiring from younger people who are willing to just say, like, no, thank you to that kind of treatment.
Yeah, things are, I think in the workplace in general, I mean, if you think about, and I certainly wasn't around in the 50s or what, it's always been very hierarchical and very much like you really just respect whatever the company wants to do. You stay at the company a really long time. I feel like, we're getting more individual rights and more degrees of freedom or whatever than we've had. And technology is definitely supporting that. And yeah, I haven't had as much exposure, right? But what you're saying is consistent with kind of the things I read as far as, younger generations and what they expect in the workplace. And, that they're coming in, that's going to be the work, it's a constant change, a conveyor belt of new kind of generations coming in to the workforce. Super, super interesting. I don't know. It just comes back to really respecting people and giving them a meaningful opportunity to exchange their effort for, you know, the purpose of the organization and vice versa. That's to me what the psychological contract is. And I feel like if you're studying work, that's such a core principle that it's just really important to like build your foundation on understanding how that works and why it's a it's a true thing. And with the AI stuff, my experience has been a little bit more the surveillance has been on proctoring, right? Because I do a lot in selection. And I just looked up because I was doing a presentation on cheating using ChatGPT for job applicants, which is a whole nother thing. You look at some of the ways people are cheating. Like you can have AI proctoring. There's so many ways to fool it. You can put fake browsers up there. There's all kinds of apps and things that you can do to where, and typically the cheaters or the people gaming it are usually ahead of the people who are trying to mitigate. So it just becomes an arms race that you can't really win, And in some situations like proctoring an assessment, I don't know what other things there are. You can bring somebody in person, or maybe I don't even know. And ChatGTP is really, really kind of raising the bar for that cat and mouse kind of thing. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's the same idea about meaningful assessment. Like the way that we measure people's skills and knowledge has to change to be more meaningful because an unproctored test might not be a meaningful measure of what they know or can do in the same way. So maybe skills assessments are more common, and the kinds of multiple choice exams that we're used to seeing go down,
They will.
right?
They will.
Instead of signs, we see samples of behavior. And it's not as scalable right now, but maybe our collective creativity, we figure out a way to scale it more. All these AI tools are not just making assessment more challenging, they're also opening up opportunities for things we hadn't considered before, like in scoring assessments. So,
Mm-hmm.
when I look in the horizon of biopsychology, I see the way that we think about assessment just totally differently. And this emphasis on simple measures of constructs that we know matter might not actually work the same way. For example, maybe we come up with problems where if you can solve them using any means at all, including AI, we're happy, right? Like
Yeah.
you solve the problem, great. So all we need to actually verify is your identity. That is, I think, more exciting than endlessly trying to figure out ways to make people not cheat on an assessment that's not that great in the first place.
Yeah, 1,000,000%. So in that kind of the thing I came away from that presentation that I put together, I came up with this term called AI enabled work ethic. So it's basically saying because job applicants and early career folks, they expect to be able to use generative AI on the job for the most part. So if you're saying don't use it in the application process, you're using it kind of for the same purposes, and you're going to use it on the job. So maybe you should be really good at it. Maybe you should know how to use it to like achieve things, right? And at the same time, you're right. I believe the modalities of assessments like multiple choice questions, Likert scales, slowly going by the wayside for task-based experiential things. Like I'm a huge believer in simulations. I'm working on my own work right now on using, large language models to role play as simulation people. Like that's my passion. I don't see it any other way, honestly, in the future. That was like my first. I remember I showed up at grad school. I don't know, you may have experienced the same thing. You got like a flat that you put a case of beverages in, right? And it was piled like that high with Xeroxed journal articles, and you had to read a lot of those journal articles. And my very first class, my first year was selection, and I had one IO class. I really felt a little lost. I don't know if other people can kind of empathize with that or not, but I was like, holy shit, what am I doing? Because we had second, third, and fourth year people in there. So it was talking to a much higher level than I was used to. And I got used to it, of course. But my paper I had to do was on work samples. And I remember I read this paper, Asher and Sciarino, 1974, one of the only sites I can actually remember from grad school. But it was about point to point correspondence between the predictor, right, the signal, and the outcome. So, somebody's got to assemble things in a factory. You give them some bolts and some screws and you time them and you look at their dexterity, and that's basically what you're using on the job. And it made so much sense to me that through my whole career I've just been waiting until simulations that are customized and stuff can be more accessible because of the technology. So we're living in a very exciting time from that, and those are much harder to cheat on, right? I would think anyway. I mean, I don't see how it's not the same as being able to look stuff up. So
Well, I mean, again, I'd say that part of what you're measuring is people's ability to use all available resources to solve the problem. And so
totally.
in the work environment, if you're the kind of person who can marshal a bunch of external people to give you advice to solve a really difficult interpersonal problem, like great, do that. That kind of resourcefulness and creativity is job relevant information, right? We want to know what that is. And sort of tying people's hands and saying, well, for the purposes of the assessment, you can't use all these things that you would definitely use later. I think that logic is starting to break down a little bit.
Yeah, I totally agree. We're entering into exciting and crazy new times. I keep saying that, but that's the life I'm living in all the time. It's just, wow, this is blowing my mind. So very cool. So what about the Wave Lab? I've seen some stuff, and some of the, I think, surveillance stuff was done there, and I think Richard Landers involved in that with you as well?
No, so the Wave Lab is my group of graduate students
Okay.
and undergraduates and
Mm-hmm.
occasionally postdocs or visiting researchers. And we're spread across 4 different universities right now, but the common thread that they have is that they are people whose research I'm advising in some way or another. So the kinds of things we work on tend to evolve based on the interests of the group. And what I like to do is have a few projects that are going on at any one time that are sort of bigger, that everyone's contributing their ideas to. And then people have smaller projects that they might be leading and sort of developing their skills in different ways. And it's a place to just have fun conversations about all of these exciting changes that we're talking about, right? It's a place to say, like, did you read this article? And can you believe? And like, what are the potential research implications here? So it's a very important, I would say, central part of what makes my job fun. And it's something that I would not be as excited about my job if I didn't have the Wave Lab. The folks I know who mostly do research on their own, I think, don't get the kind of enjoyment out of it that I do. So that said, though, I have outside collaborations also with lots of researchers. I mean, you mentioned Richard. He and I have written a bunch of papers together, and actually, we just finished writing a book together, which is something we're both really, really excited about. It's not a how to book, it's more like a why book. So, why do we do research? What are the decisions that we make, and what are the implications of those decisions in terms of how the research ends up being useful in the world or limited? And how can we sort of think through the process of becoming a researcher along the way? And so the book is sort of organized, and first you think about like your identity. Who are you as a researcher? And then how do you choose the research questions that you want to work on? And then from there we sort of talk about various specific tactics and approaches and why you might choose one over another. But we're really, really excited about that book, and it's coming out any second now. Actually, I think it's available for pre-order as of yesterday.
Oh,
So
well,
we're
tell us the name and stuff. You got to promote it, please, because people need to read it.
so the book is called Research Methods for Industrial Organizational Psychology, Science and Practice, which is definitely a mouthful. And I think if you go to my LinkedIn or Richard's LinkedIn, we have a link for the pre-order. But it's something that I hope people will use in courses or just for their own leisure reading to reflect on these choices. Like, why did you choose that research question that you study? Like, why not some other research question? What are the real implications in terms of ethical consequences for the kinds of situations you might find yourself in? And how do you share the research knowledge that you generate in a responsible and ethical way? So it's those kinds of questions that we tackle, and I think it's a lot of fun. I put all my dorkiest stories in there too, so you can be
Oh
on the
yeah.
lookout for those.
Okay, well, give us a preview of one of your dorkiest stories. I got to hear it.
I'm sort of afraid to give them away, but I frequently use the cocktail party metaphor to explain how a person should enter a research field. So maybe you've heard this. I did not invent it for sure, but I've sort of perfected it. But the idea is that when you go to a cocktail party, let's imagine that you're in the car on the way over and you hear this really cool NPR story about bees. And you're like, oh, bees, that's so interesting. I can't wait to get to the party and tell everyone about bees. And you get there and you get to the party and there are people standing around in groups of 3 or 5 and, like how people do at parties. You can't just stand in the middle of the room and start screaming about bees because you won't get invited to more parties after that, right? That's not right. What you actually do is you approach one of the groups, you listen first, right? You first listen to what they're saying. And then maybe they're talking about climate change and you can contribute something to say like, well, here's how bees, relate to climate change. Here's how they'll be affected by climate change. But you have to first listen to what they're talking about and make sure that you're meaningfully adding to the conversation, not just changing the subject to what you want to talk about. And that's how research works, right? When you are writing a research paper, you are entering into a conversation with your peers. And so you first need to listen to what they're talking about. And then second, figure out how you can meaningfully advance that conversation. And I've found that analogy just works incredibly well when people are sort of stuck about, what to write about or who, like how to frame it. When you frame it in terms of this is a conversation and the scientific field is having lots of conversations at any given moment and you need to pick one and contribute to it, that sort of changes everything.
Yeah, and something that you're passionate about. I feel like that's also a good guide. So, at a cocktail party, what cocktail are you ordering?
It depends on my mood. I'm actually a pretty big fan of cocktails, and so I like to make different classic cocktails depending on the occasion. So I could never pick a favorite. That's impossible.
Gotcha. Okay,
But I like the classics, I'll say that.
just gotta name one. I gotta name one. It doesn't even have to be your favorite. What's one that you like to make the most, or free association? When I said that, did a particular cocktail pop into your mind?
Well, I guess one would be a Gibson, which is very similar to martini, but with an onion instead of an olive. And then the other would be just sort of any variation on Manhattan. So sort of playing around with ratios and different amaros to make them appropriate for the occasion. Those would be my two main go-tos.
Gotcha. So next year, PsyOps in New Orleans, and you can come down here. You can go to Galatoire's and get a French 75, or you could get a Sazerac. Two really great cocktails
Well,
from down
when
here.
I'm in New Orleans, my first stop is at Cure. Actually,
Yeah,
Cure
yeah,
is one of
sure.
the best cocktail bars in the world. So I'll drink whatever they're pouring there.
Yeah, we know the guy that owns that. Yeah, he had some other stuff too. Both my in-laws are in the alcoholic beverage industry down here, so we got a lot of fun with that. So you'll be able to do that next year. That's awesome.
Cool. I come to New Orleans a lot, so
Oh,
I'll
you do?
definitely call you next time I'm in
Oh,
town.
awesome.
Hmm.
Cool. So, NSA, tell us a little bit about that. That National Science Association. What is it? Well, I should know what it stands for.
NSF, National Science Foundation.
NSF. Well, no, I had a typo on my notes. Yeah.
NSA is a different organization that even if I did work there, I couldn't tell you about it. But the
Yeah, National Science Foundation. I know what it is. Good. Tell us about it. What are you doing there? That's amazing that you had a chance to be part of that.
Yeah, it was a really terrific learning experience. So I was there for a total of about 2.5 years, wrapped up last spring. The role I had was program director. So what that means is that I have a program that is sort of mine to oversee. I receive the applications, make funding decisions, and sort of work with researchers to shape their ideas and get them in the best possible shape for funding. So it's just this totally unique opportunity to get a sense of the whole field. Like, what are people's cutting edge ideas? And not just from psychology either, but from all across the social sciences, to just think about like what is the state of research in organizations. So I learned so much and got to meet so many interesting people. And then the other thing that I did there, in addition to managing my program, was participate in a cross agency sort of working group related to the future of work. And so I was able to sort of chair that group for a year. And I would say my main contribution there was helping people understand the contribution of the social sciences in this conversation, right? That otherwise might be dominated by AI people and technologists and engineers, to say like this is what we gain when we have a really solid understanding of human beings and systems, and how it can just really save a lot of wasted effort pursuing the wrong kinds of questions, or give a new level of understanding to what we're seeing. And I would say I was pretty successful. So I was very proud of that in shaping people's perspectives. Now, what came out of that is an edited book that should be out in about 6 months ish, called The Future of Human Technology Partnerships at Work.
Ooh,
And
cool.
the point of that book is to make the argument that when we talk about humans and technology working as teams and organizations, it's really, I mean, there's a lot to say, obviously, but there's not much to say that applies to every kind of human machine team, right? Like these teams are actually highly contextualized
Mm-hmm.
depending on the kind of work. and the kind of worker. So every part of the book takes like a specific deep dive on one kind of work: nursing, hospitality, oil and gas, construction, lawyers, right? Like what it means to work with technology in each of those
Wow.
contexts is so different. So
Wow.
the book is meant to sort of show that.
Did you have a particular vocation or technology human partnership that you focused on within that book or within that context?
No, so the book tries to be as broad as possible, and
Ah,
then so each chapter has a different job focus, and the authors of the chapters are people who are experts in those domains. So
gotcha.
I don't, I'm not an expert in those domains, the people who are contributing the work. And then the other section of the book is sort of integrative themes, things like lifelong learning, which is just showing to be such an important element of every kind of job,
Yep.
or access to work for people with either disabilities or other challenges that make access to work difficult, so like even something like childcare
Yeah.
availability, right? So there's a chapter that talks about those kinds of things.
Cool. So overall, I guess what came out of that whole experience that you feel like is going to have the most practical impact on things in our world? It's had a lot of smart people studying different things, thinking about technology, sponsored by, the government, like it's a big deal. So, what practical that we might see in the future is a result of, the foundation in general and the work that you were part of?
Yeah, so something cool about NSF is that they post all of the funded projects on their website and you can go see what they are. Because the philosophy is that this is a federal government agency, which means that it's meant to serve the common good, right? Like they're not keeping things secret here. So all of the results from NSF funded research are available to the public. I mean, you can access them as your right as someone who lives in the United States and supports the National Science Foundation with your tax money, right? So a lot of these projects lead to research insights. Many of them lead to new technologies that are developed that affect our everyday life. In the Future of Work program, the proposals were mostly about building new technologies to solve work problems, like make a robot that picks fruit or cleans salmon or whatever. But like those products will enter the market eventually because of the innovation that's happening in these research teams. So if you're curious about that, then I think it's fun to just spend a rainy afternoon reading the NSF website, because they do a great job showing about like new products, new patents, and things that come out of the money that they spend.
Yeah, and we're in a crazy exciting time for innovation and new things. We're just evolving every field, with access to technology, and not just large language models, which is a technology we all seem to talk about now because it's so damn interesting. So cool. Well, let's wrap it up here. What is your take? Just think about the workplace 10 years from now, 2034. What do you think is going to be like? What are maybe some of the differences between what we have now? I don't know. Just free association, like if you had to picture it or visualize it, what do you think is going to be going on?
Yeah, I think right now we have a situation where work is changing really quickly, obviously. And there's also these huge gaps between, there are job seekers who have skills and there are employers who want those exact skills and somehow they can't find each other. There are kinds of jobs that are incredibly difficult to fill where we're predicting huge shortages, right? Like aviation,
Yep.
plumbing, air traffic control, right? That we're not going to have people to do those jobs, which means that we have to really change the way we think about training and education to sort of better align with the needs that we know that we have. So what I see happening is a different kind of emphasis in K-12 and in college about the world that you're entering and the kinds of skills you might need to enter that world, and more of a focus on the kinds of things that machines can't do.
Yeah.
So I think that'll be a really exciting time. And there are plenty of things that machines can't do, by the way, that they probably will never be able to do. So what I see is a sort of re-emphasis on those things, and better alignment with the job market that we actually have in front of us.
Yeah, I would agree. I don't think machines are coming for everybody's jobs. I think, you kind of repurpose what you're really good at, even from an individual differences standpoint, right? There's certain things that a machine can take away a layer of stuff that you might not have been as good at, or it might have been boring work, and then you can partner with that machine to be better, to be a whole is greater than the sum of its parts. I would think, and I don't always buy into the whole, everybody's jobs are going to be gone and what's going to happen, and people will be wandering around like zombies needing to be subsidized by the government because there won't be any work. I mean, I've read some books that kind of go that far, right, with it, but I don't really believe that either. And people, we need work just like work needs us, and I feel like we're always going to find our way to doing something meaningful. Hopefully, if you're in touch with that as an individual, and are able to be cognizant of the fact that that's what you need to do, right? I mean, we've all had jobs that we don't like for for whatever reasons at some point, but those serve as sterling examples of why you do want to get something you do like. So I think it's going to be an interesting ride. I think it'll look more different 10 years ahead than it did 10 years backward, right? Which is 2014. Yeah, I guess, we were talking, that was right when everybody started talking about big data. I remember that PSYOP in Hawaii, one of my favorite PSYOPs because I love Hawaii. That was all big data. I think I was on three different panels about big data, big data, big data. Now all data is big data, right? I mean, almost. It's like there's so much of it.
10 years ago, people were also saying that within 10 years, 70% of jobs would be automated, which obviously did not happen, which is why you shouldn't always listen to people who think that they can predict the future. But I believe fundamentally that work is about solving problems, and innovation comes with new problems. They're different problems than we had before,
Absolutely.
right? But we still have problems to solve. We will still, like you said, need to derive meaning from our lives. And maybe that doesn't look like paid work in the same way. Maybe we don't have a 40-hour work week because it's not actually necessary, because we can reorganize ourselves in different ways. But the kinds of work that right now go unvalued, like care work is a good example of that, right? Maybe we reorganize around those kinds of things about contributing to our communities and taking care of each other. So we will figure it out, because we always do. There's no doubt about that. But I think ultimately we do need to be a bit open-minded, and the idea that you could just sort of expect the world to compensate you because it changed is not reasonable, and it just never has been reasonable.
Yeah, I completely agree. Well, thank you so much. It's really, really good conversation. You got a lot of wisdom and a lot of experience looking at things from a very, I'd say, legitimate methodological standpoint, if that makes any sense, right? Like that structure of research. I think a lot of times we consume research and it's not always really that well done. I mean, people throw numbers and studies out there all the time, and you got to be a little discerning. So it's great to see quality, practical stuff, and I appreciate so much your time today, and look forward to seeing you at PSYOP.
Thanks. This is a really fun conversation, and yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing you soon at PSYOP.
Cheers. Thanks so much for listening to today's episode. I want to encourage all the listeners out there to share this podcast with their friends, families, colleagues. People don't find podcasts just randomly typically. They do so at the recommendations of others that they trust, and, people who've really enjoyed that content and want to share. And I certainly sincerely hope you've enjoyed the content of this episode and the others like it, and encourage you to please share with your friends, family, and coworkers. Let them know about this podcast and what we have to offer. They're going to definitely walk away smarter, sharper, and thinking about some really interesting issues, which is what we all want, right? Thank you very much. Until next time.